It's been a while, and we're so glad to have you and speak to you. And since you've been intimidating a lot of people for a while, I think we'll try and turn the tables a little bit. Let's start with reading as a whole. Everyone here is a reader. So the first question is, do you think we overrate reading? Do you think it's all of us make it sound more important than it is?
No, I disagree. I think we underrate reading vastly. And obviously, I would be biased about saying this because endowment effect and all that. I happen to be a reader myself, so obviously, I'm more likely, therefore, to overrate it. But having said that, I don't think we underrate it. I think, look, what is special about our species is that we have language, we can tell stories about the world, and we can carry knowledge forward. Every generation isn't discovering things for itself and reinventing the wheel, as it were. Our accumulated knowledge, not just scientific knowledge, but other forms of understanding of the world, are carried forward through time. And that's what is so brilliant about our species. And to me, the dominant way in which this is done is through the most effective way through which this is done is through writing. And so I think if you want to make sense of the world, look, how do we make sense of the world? We do it by joining dots. And it stands to reason that the more dots you can join, the clearer your picture will be, the better your resolution, so to say. And I think reading gives you more dots than anything else you can do. There are proxies and replacements like listening to good podcasts, but
Okay.
reading is absolutely up there for me.
And as someone who is in the thick of things when it comes to podcasts, and I think you've added it to your repertoire in a sense. So one question a lot of the subscribers had was, how has it changed the way you read? Do you have to read more to prepare for your podcasts? How has that shaped your reading in the last few years?
That's a great question, and it's actually actually has changed the way I read nonfiction. In the sense that I do a lot of prep for my podcast. For those who are not familiar, it's a 2 to 3 hour. Each episode is a 2 to 3 hour long form conversation with an expert on a subject. And obviously, if you're going to maintain a meaningful conversation for that long and go as deep as you want to, then you have to do a fair amount of research and understand the subject yourself. Not so much that you are the expert on it, but enough to be able to ask intelligent questions and drive the conversation. And so I do a ton of reading for every episode. Like I did a 2 episode special on Mahatma Gandhi with Ramchandra Guha, whose book had
Right.
just come out at that time. And I read some 35 books on Gandhi for that, though some of them were rereads, and I was obviously very into the subject. And that's more than I normally do. But I'd normally, like, if I'm doing a podcast with a guest on, say, subject A, and he's written one book on it, I'll read that book. I might read other books by him. I might read other books on the subject. And I'm specifying books. I'm not Googling and just reading articles or going through Wikipedia and all of that. I'm actually trying to do the kind of deep readings. I can take the conversation in useful directions and go deeper rather than stick with the obvious stuff, which is something that a 2 to 3 hour podcast makes necessary. And this has changed the way I read, because now when I read nonfiction, even if I'm not reading for the specific purpose of preparing for a podcast, I'll take notes. Just as a habit, when I read nonfiction, I take notes, which kind of helps me distill the main points of the main learnings in my own head. And you could say, in a sense, to go back to my earlier analogy of connecting the dots to get a picture of the world, I'm marking out dots in the book, which I might want to connect later. So it has changed the way I read, and for the better. So I'm grateful for that.
Okay. There's a question from Manas. Manas wants to ask you something connected to what you just said. So Manas, you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you can hear me.
Hi Amit, good afternoon. First of all, a big fan. I'm sorry I am a late follower of your The Seen and the Unseen. So my question was actually, as Ramanan put it, related to what you already said. So in one of the episodes, you'd mentioned that you target yourself to go through and not only read but absorb 20 books in a month, and you generally manage to do that, as is pretty evident from what you have already said. And for those who watch your podcasts, the level of questions clearly show the amount of depth that you go into before getting anybody on that. So just wanted to understand, how do you fit in that into your existing workload? Because you seem to be doing many things at once, not only the seen and the unseen, but a book review every week and several other things which you keep mentioning on the podcast. So that was the question. Thanks.
Thanks for the kind words and thanks for the question. It's a good question. And I have to say that I am obviously speaking from a position of extreme privilege in the sense that I have the time to do this much reading because I don't have a full time job. I decided some 13 years ago that I'm not going to do regular employment. I'm going to work from home. I'm going to be the master of my own time. And when you're the master of your own time, it's still easier said than done to do all the things you want to because as I have known for 13 years, and many of you are now finding out with all this self quarantining and this work from home stuff, that is very hard to discipline yourself and be able to pack in as much into a day as you would like to. So that's an ongoing challenge, whether it's with my work or with my reading. But what I try to do is I have tried various hacks like setting aside specific hours every day for reading, like saying, okay, I'll read 1 hour every day minimum between X and X. Uh, Very often, once you're engrossed in a book, you go on doing more. But frankly, all those hacks don't really work with me. I don't have specific hours of the day when I read. A lot of my reading is driven by the impetus of preparing for podcasts. A lot of it is, I think, driven by naturally getting drawn into rabbit holes. So I could be like exploring one particular subject, and what I do when I read nonfiction, and which is a useful habit, and I think most serious readers probably do the same, is that I'll often go to the footnotes. So if I find something interesting, I'll go to the footnotes. I'll look for those books online if they sound interesting to me, and that draws me into further reading. So I read a lot because of that. So it's very arbitrary. Some of my reading is drawn by the research I need to do for my podcast. But having said that, it doesn't feel like work because I would be doing that episode for my podcast on that subject because I am already interested. So it's not, I never have to force myself to read a book per se. And I think part of the whole project of reading more comes down to just building the habit. There's a very good writer called James Clear who's written this great book called Atomic Habits, which I recommend strongly to everyone. And he writes a fantastic newsletter online. And his latest newsletter basically had this really nice line which said that when your habits and your goals conflict, your habits win. So then what is important is that you make your habits and your goals coincide. And one of the very useful tips I picked up from his book Atomic Habits, which is one of the finest self-help books I've read, though I generally disdain the genre, but that's a very good book, is that you should not, when you want to reform the work you do or the life you lead, you should not think in terms of the things you want to do, but in terms of the person you want to be. So you first visualize in your head that I am so and once you visualize that, then you automatically internalize in your mind the things that person does. For example, if you think of yourself as someone who is an intellectual omnivore and is devouring a lot of knowledge, and someone who naturally reads X amount, then it becomes far easier to do that rather than set out a routine and say, okay, between 4 and 5 I will read and blah blah blah. But if you internalize your self image as a person who naturally reads that much, who naturally wants to gather knowledge on various subjects, or whatever it is, not necessarily knowledge and reading related, then that helps. And I found that a very useful hack, and one that I try to implement with almost no success because I'm incredibly undisciplined and so on and so forth. But I do manage to read more than others do, not as much as I would like, but more than others do.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks, Manas. So, Amit, has this come at a cost in the sense that are you reading much less fiction than you used to? Are you going out much less and staying locked down even before you were asked to?
Yeah, there are trade-offs everywhere. Every time you choose, anytime that you choose something, you're choosing that over something else. Yeah, there's always an opportunity cost. But the point is that if you enjoy what you're doing, it really doesn't matter. And I enjoy it. And I have always been a social distancing kind of person. So it's not like I go out much and all that. But one of the decisions I made this year is that to read more, I will watch Netflix less. Netflix, Hotstar, all of that less. So yeah, that's a cost. Now it's a cost that I am privileged enough to be able to handle this trade-off in a way that I am doing the things I like. Everybody doesn't really have that luxury. You have to do certain things you don't like to make a living or to fit in into your community or your family or whatever. I'm in the extremely fortunate position that I can tailor my life and my habits to the things that I like. A lot of that is really good luck. And as far as fiction is concerned, yeah, that is, I read Ghachar Ghochar last night, the fantastic book by Vivek Shanbhag, and it's an absolute masterpiece. And if you guys like Parasite, the movie, you'll really like Ghachar Ghochar. I found it very similar in certain ways, such as the subtle way it peels layer after layer of families and so on. It's great. But in general, I read far less fiction than I would like to, and that's something that I want to fix, yes.
All right. And just going back to the point you made earlier, so clearly it's easier to be in an environment where you just carry on reading, as it were, rather than having to fashion a habit, as you said, between 4 to 5 every day. Tell us a little bit about your reading environment offline in terms of, say, do you have any tools? Do you use note-taking apps? Has it evolved over time? Because when we last spoke, we lived in a very different world. And I'm sure that will be true the next time we speak as well. So tell us a little bit about the reading ambience around yourself right now.
Okay, so I have Sundoku, of course, as so many people do, so many of you. So I'm surrounded by books. I probably have around 3,000-4,000 books around me in my studies, which is very nice. My reading is a mix of physical and ebooks. I like ebooks because I can take notes. I turn everything into Mobi and I read it on Kindle and I take copious notes. And the note taking is very useful because then later, for example, if I want to transfer some of that onto a Word doc, I can just open the Kindle app on my laptop and do that easily. I also, but actually, recently I found that I prefer reading physical books, which is a question of habit. I'm not one of those sort of Luddites who says no, ebooks are not for me. Ebooks are great, but I like reading physical books. And what I do with physical books, which goes against Indian sanskar, is that I make copious notes within the book. So I'll underline a lot, and in the 2 or 3 blank pages at the end, I'll put page numbers and little notes that I want to. And whether or not I refer to it in future, I think it just helps me absorb knowledge better. So I don't have that typical Indian dogma against not defacing a book and all of that. I write copiously within books.
All right. Thank you. I think Harish has a question for you. So go ahead, Harish.
Yeah, with all this, hi Amit, with all this, how does TikTok fit into your schedule then?
Hey Harish, you've hit a weak spot. Yeah, the thing is, I think all of us have our own sort of obsessions slash addictions to fight, and my current one seems to be TikTok. Having said that, I've really over the last few weeks watched tens of thousands of TikTok's videos, and I've even categorized within that the dominant traits in Indian society, what they reveal about us, both the good and the bad. And it's an extraordinarily creative space actually, because I think our elite Bollywood curators don't get Indian culture at all, don't get the zeitgeist at all and what is happening out there. And I think you get a much better sense of that in TikTok. Obviously, everything that is wrong with us as a society, whether it's sexism and misogyny, whether it's a normalization of casual everyday violence, that on TikTok. But you also see a lot of great creativity. You also see political and social commentary, which would get you into trouble if you were doing it not on TikTok. But I don't want to, but all of this that I say about it giving sociological and anthropological insight could just be the me rationalizing this dangerous habit that I need to get away from. These days I'm trying to write seriously. What I have decided is that in an X band of hours I put away my phone and don't access it. There's a very good book by Cal Newport called Deep Work, which you guys should read. And the central thesis of that is that, look, every time we are disturbed when we are concentrating, it takes about 15 to 23 minutes to get that level of deep concentration back. And because we are surrounded by distractions all the time, the kind of work that we end up doing is constant shallow work. And deep concentration is deep work, as Newport says, is almost impossible. So what we have to do is figure out ways to be able to do deep work. And this depends. Neil Stephenson's technique is not to be online at all. He doesn't even have an email ID, apparently. He just isolates himself and writes his books. What academics will do is one term they'll focus on doing a lot of packing and teaching assignments, and one term they'll give to their research. And what people like me have to do is that you try to set a routine. So within a day for a few hours, you give that for deep work. You shut yourself off from all distractions and you just try to focus on whatever you're working on, whatever project it is, whether it's writing or reading. And the challenge that I haven't been able to conquer is just managing to keep my phone aside and focusing on work. I think I rambled a bit. Your question was about TikTok. It's lovely. You must watch it.
Thanks, Amit. At this point, I'm depending on your curation of TikTok videos, so continue with it.
So here's an open offer to people on this group. I am supposed to be, some of my friends have asked me to form a group exclusively for TikTok and share some of the best videos I've found over time, because whenever I see a good video, I download it. If any of you are interested in joining, send me your phone number via Harish and Ramanan, then I will add you there, but you will get hundreds of videos. So be prepared for that.
All right. So I think that's an offer we will not refuse. Since we all said and done, we are suckers for magic bullets and read and hacks. So is a secret reading hack, despite all we just spoke about, that you have and you've been holding close to your chest?
No, man. If you do, kindly let me know, because I should also read more than I do. The reason I read more than a lot of people is I just have more time and I give more time to it. But I have the same problems in terms of attention span and concentration and all of that. So I have no hack to offer. I'm sorry.
Okay. Since you brought up Cal Newport, so Cal Newport, Donald Knuth, like Stephenson, Knuth is famous for not having an email ID, I think since the 70s. So I think a lot of it does come down to whether you're able to wrest control over your time and your schedule. And I think the decision you made all those years ago, in some sense, the fact that you can get this done, I think, has its roots in some of those decisions. So since we spoke about TikTok and curation, because a lot of questions on podcasting, so I'm just going to get this out of the way before that. These days, how do you pick what you read? In fact, I think Vineet has a related question. So Vineet, you may want to ask your question now, your first question.
Hey, Amit. So since you're reading a lot, this might be kind of a difficult question, but are there any top 3 websites or blogs that you go to for reading articles?
Yeah, in the age of blogs is pretty much dead, I have to say, with great regret. But the only blog that I read regularly and which I think is fantastic is Marginal Revolution. That's at marginalrevolution.com. Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok, both of them have come on my podcast as well. And Tyler is again a classic polymath, omnivore, and a great deep knowledge of many subjects. So that's what I read. Otherwise, it's very arbitrary, and I use social media as a filter, in the sense I'll see an interesting link on Twitter and just follow it. Back in the day when blogs were active, I used to go to sites like aldaily.com. I don't know if that's still alive, artsandlettersdaily.com, and there were various ways to filter content. But now all of us consume content in much more discrete and haphazard ways. So no, I don't really have anything useful to add there.
No problem.
So, go ahead.
My way of curating content is to read what Amit reads. That's what I do.
Thank you. Oh my God. If your life ends up badly, I apologize in advance.
Thank you.
Amit, since we spoke about James Clear's and his newsletter, do you think newsletters are still an underrated source of interesting curation?
I think they definitely are. I don't consume them much. I subscribe to just 3 or 4 and it just happenstance. I'm not a heavy consumer, but of course they're underrated. Anything that gives you knowledge is underrated, and what a good newsletter can do. See, every newsletter, I think every book, every article is curating a version of the world for you, curating certain views and presenting them in a coherent way, so you don't have to go out and get that knowledge yourself, and caveat emptor all the time, of course. But yeah, of course, I think any way of getting knowledge is fundamentally underrated.
All right. So since we have so many ways to access and curate information, what do you think is the writer's edge today? Where do people like you seek the edge? Because a while ago it was you got to information first and you brought it to the rest of us. Today you are curating the same feeds, that you have access to the same feeds that the rest of us do at the same time. So what is the edge? Is it in the connecting of dots? Is that still something that's really hard for most people to do? And so what do you think the edge really comes from? Because you've had a following that's followed you from channel to channel, right? From the days of, say, starting right from Click Info, which is when some of us first encountered you, to your blog. Then you had your fiction book, you had your columns, your podcast. So you've taken your audience along. So what's that edge that a good writer like you thinks that you've still got?
Okay, a couple of ways to answer that question. One, of course, as you put it in your question, is connecting the dots. I won't refer to myself here, but I think the writers that I do read and look forward to for inside are people who can connect various dots. People like Tyler Cowen of Marginal Revolution, for example. You need not agree with everything they say, but they have their specific perspectives. They have a lot to back it up, and there's a lot of knowledge in there. So it's the thing is, the world is full of complexity. There is too much information for all of us to fathom or make sense of. And in the earlier days, you might have gone to a religious guru or a godman to give you a narrative that explains the world. And today we know that those narratives are obviously fake news, but we look for other kinds of narratives that get closer and closer to approximations of the truth, though there is still a lot of fake news out there. And I guess that's where the writers I read, that's why I read them. I think they sharpen my perspectives of the world. The thing to watch out for, though, is that once you make up your mind, that if you start believing in a set of simple narratives that give you comfort, then you close yourself off to others and you get drawn into an echo chamber. And this happens more and more in a political and ideological sense. And this is my big complaint with social media, that the world is incredibly polarized now. What you find on social media increasingly is that people aren't interested in the truth. People are interested in winning the argument, and people are interested in virtue signaling to raise their status in their own in group, whether they are on the left or the right. It doesn't really matter. But getting at the truth is not so important, because the truth doesn't seem to matter so much. And one of the sort of refreshing things about doing the podcast is that I started with 20-minute episodes, and now I've come to a place where every conversation is between 2 to 3 hours. And my initial impression of all of us was that, look, we have short attention spans and we can't take too much knowledge. But what I've found with the growing popularity of the seen and the unseen is that people are hungry for deep knowledge. It is not true that people have short attention spans. They are hungry for deep knowledge. And in fact, the overwhelming feedback that I get about the length of the podcast is that it is not long enough. And pro tip, if any of you are new to listening to podcasts, try listening at higher speeds. Like I listen to my own show at 2.3x. Go to 1.3, that'll normalize. Go to 1.6, that'll normalize. And you can easily go till at least 2 and 2x. And what that means is that then you're absorbing a lot of knowledge much, much faster. And just to preempt the sort of next question about podcast versus reading, the interesting thing about podcast and the central insight that I'll share with you is that, podcasting existed since the early 2000s, but it exploded with the invention of the smartphone. And the reason it did so was that there are three particular use cases in which people listen to podcasts, which is commuting, working out, and doing errands. All of them, you can just have a smartphone tucked in your pocket or on your armband or whatever, and you're listening from there. In all of them, your audience is a captive audience. Like when you sit down to read a book or watch a YouTube video, you can click on the next tab, you can pick up something, you can start a conversation with something. But when you're listening to a podcast in these particular use cases, you're a captive audience. You've chosen to listen to something. You've already made that kind of commitment. And if you're listening at double speed, you'll get through 2 hours of content in, say, an hour. And 2 hours of content will contain about 20 to 25,000 words. And if you think about consuming 25,000 words in a book in a couple of hours, it's much harder. You may not read so fast. Your attention may wander. So podcasts are actually a killer app for absorbing and disseminating knowledge and insight.
Thanks, Amit. That was a great point. I think the information density of that, I think you've seen that because you produce it at so many different sizes in some sense. And I think you also come to the podcasting section, and I think this was a question that Sneha actually wanted to ask you about the length of your podcast. She also has a couple of other questions to ask. So Sneha, fire right ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ramanand. Hi, Amit. Been listening to your podcast, and I must really say that I've been hooked onto it in the quarantine times as well. While I'm working on the errands, I keep listening to it. So thanks for disseminating your knowledge. So on the length of the podcast, while you did mention that 2 hours doesn't seem to be that long, any specific reason why you've kept it to this long form? And do you think exceeding it would be more or reducing it would be less? And then I'll rally on to the other questions.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words. As far as the length is concerned, the show evolved. It started as a 20-minute thing. I thought, oh, I didn't listen to podcasts earlier, right? So I just started doing my podcast without listening to them. And my impression was people have short attention spans. Who's going to listen? 20 minutes must be optimal, blah, blah, blah. With time, I realized that is not the case because of the reasons I mentioned before this. The three use cases where you have captive audience and the fact that people listen at higher speeds, often double speed or at least 1.5x. But what I also found was that look, this is the key feature of the medium. Okay, if you're doing a conversation with any other expert in a newspaper, you'll get 800 words. Even in a long form article like a Caravan or a Guardian long reads would give you, you'll get 5 to 8,000 or whatever. And here I've had conversations which are 35,000, 40,000 words long, and people actually listening to the full thing. It allows you to go as deep as you want. And my approach to the podcast has been that I am, and one reason I don't follow the news cycle is that I am not necessarily restricting myself to this point in time to a listener now. I am thinking that ideally, and this is obviously ambitious, but if someone discovers a podcast 30 years from now, a lot of the archive should still have a value for them and be timeless in terms of the context that they give, like specifically. And I have occasionally taken on timely subjects like the abrogation of 370 in Kashmir, where I did an episode with Srinath Raghavan. I did another episode with him for when the CAA thing broke. But in both of them, it was a couple of weeks after the news cycle had started, where one had time to sit down and really consider. And both of them have such historical depth and detail that it doesn't really matter when you listen to it. And so a friend of mine was starting a podcast recently, and the key piece of advice I gave to her, which is something that you might want to consider for any project you take on in any media, is that I am not going to second guess myself about what people want to listen to now. So number one, I'm going to be authentic to myself and what my own quest is. And number two, my aim is not going to be to please someone who may listen today. My aim is that if someone discovers me around episode 150, as some of you may, then you can look at the archives and go, wow. And then it's something binge worthy, and there's a wealth of material there. So that's really the reason for the wealth, for the length. I am not competing with everyone else who is part of this news cycle in terms of the newspapers and the TV channels and even the blogs and so on. I'm trying to create something that is timeless and will have value now and for a long time in the future.
Thanks, Amit. I would again delve on to something that you just mentioned a while back. As a reader and as a public intellectual, do you also see yourself suffering from this Dunning-Kruger effect, that the more you read, the more doubtful you become? And rather than being labeled as a left winger or a right winger, you're always on this quest to know more and probably not as opinionated as you are thought to be.
That's such a great question. Yeah, it reminds me of that quote about how the foolish are full of certainty. And the more basically, the more humble you become at an epistemic level because you realize you don't know a lot. I think where I am is that I am very sure of values and I'm always open to being corrected on facts. So, in terms of how I look at the world, the prism of values that I look at the world through, which is basically one that values individual freedom and individual rights, I am very certain, and my certainty there will not be diminished. But in terms of facts, the world is extremely complex, and the more you read and the more podcasts I do, the more you realize that. And just to give live example of this, I'd done an episode about a year back in March last year, in fact, if I remember, it released with Akar Patel about the Hindutva movement. And there both of us said that okay, there's no intellectual tradition there. It is basically bigotry and misogyny wrapped up in labels of conservative and whatever, but there's no actual analog of Burkean conservatism in India, and there's no intellectual tradition per se. That's what both of us said on the show, and I believed it. And subsequently, I went on to do a series of episodes, first with Suyash Rai, then Rahul Varma, who's written a book on ideology in India, and then most importantly, with Akshay Mukul, who's written this fantastic book on the history of the Gita Press, and I did a great episode on that. And over this series of episodes, not just these three, but others, I got to realize that I'd been wrong. There is a coherent, cogent intellectual right-wing tradition in India. It's existed mostly in the languages, which is why English-speaking elites are unaware of it. Now, I disagree with all the premises and conclusions of that tradition, viscerally, but it is there, and it's something that we have to acknowledge, and we can't simply say that it's only bigotry and misogyny wrapped up in a rationalization of labels, as I used to believe. That's an example of a subject on which, in the course of doing this podcast over this period of time, uh, my views have evolved. And again, they've evolved from a point of view of the facts. They haven't evolved from a point of view of the values. My values remain the same, which is why this is a tradition I disagree with strongly. But now I know that this tradition is there, and that we need to engage with it all the more seriously for that reason, and not just mock these people as being whatever they are.
Thanks, Amit. So I've actually heard the one that you talked about, Akshay Mukul's, and it was a fascinating podcast. So on that note, and this would probably be my last question. So when one of the authors that I've been reading about and would love to have on your show would be, in case you already haven't thought about it, yeah, that's a request from my side. If you could have him on your show and quiz him on that. The other is a comment to make. What I've really gained from your podcast is that I've come to know about Indian authors whom I earlier did not know of. So for example, I was listening to this podcast by Ira Mukhoti and Madhavi Menon. And what they interestingly do bring about is the diversity and the female gaze towards Indian history. And I must really compliment you on bringing writers like Ira and Madhavi. So yeah, continue with the good work, Amit.
Thank you, and that's actually something I make an effort to do. And obviously, I've had more male guests and female guests on my show, but I try to make sure I have enough female guests, and I go out of my way to try to learn about I should be reading and so on. And both the people you mentioned, Ira and Madhvi, are of course absolute rock stars. Yeah, and as far as Makarand Paranjpe, thank you for the suggestion. I'm not a big fan of the gentleman. Maybe I might have thought about it 3 or 4 years earlier, but now I think with with some intellectuals, quote unquote intellectuals, I think what has happened is that their political imperatives drive a lot of the positions that they take, and that affects the amount of intellectual honesty and openness which they bring to the table, and that is something that kind of holds me back, whether I'm talking of an intellectual on the right or the left, that I want to talk to someone who has that intellectual honesty and who will not feel compelled to defend positions because he has now taken a sort of a tribalistic position. And again, that applies to both the right and the left.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sneha. They were very interesting questions. And I think Trilok, whose mic isn't working today, says that Manu Pillai is another example. I just wanted to, I think, call out that particular episode. On a slightly lighter note, one of our subscribers, Samir, who's not here on the call today, wanted us to tell you that can you please take a break on your podcast, because it'll help him catching up. He's not commuting anymore. We spoke about captive audience. He's not doing that anymore thanks to the lockdown. So he's lagging behind on the podcast. So please hold on. Give him a chance to catch up.
What can I say? I'm actually banked till June. So I went all out and recorded 10 episodes in 10 days during a recent trip to Delhi, which completely killed me because the amount of prep I do is insane. I hardly slept. But so I did 6 episodes in Bangalore, 10 in Delhi, a couple in Bombay. But the good thing is I'm set till the first week of June. Yeah, by all means, catch up at your own pace and skip the ones that don't interest you. But I just think that, and this is another thing that a piece of advice that I think applies to life in general and not just podcasts, that once you set a weekly habit, just keep it going, because if you fall off the wagon, you don't know whether you'll be able to get back on. You'll always be able to find reasons not to get back on, or to delay getting on for just one more week. So I don't want to do that. So barring some kind of personal catastrophe, I don't see myself taking a break from the seen and the unseen anytime soon.
In some sense, it's easier to stay at that next step rather than start all over again. We'll give Samir the bad news, the good and the bad news. It's both in one. So I think in general, people want to know what happens. How is the prep for a podcast? How is it different from, say, writing an article? I think we touched on some parts of it, but if you can just give us a succinct kind of summary of what a typical behind the scenes prep for a podcast looks like these days.
Okay, I can only share my personal experience, which will be unique in India because no one does this kind of length. Everybody's doing half an hour or max 1 hour interviews, those who do. And the thing is, it's exponentially harder to do something that is aiming for 3 hours, because the kind of depth of knowledge you need is far more. You want to keep the conversation going and beyond the point. Once you get past the obvious stuff, there's really not a good way to do that except research really hard. So what I do for my research is, of course, I'll read multiple books and sources. I'll take copious notes. Also, what is I think important is that it's not just the process before, it's also the process during, in the sense that you want to avoid the typical mistakes. You don't want to go there, say, with a narrative fixed in your head that these are the 10 questions I will ask, and then the person answers one and you move on to the next and you're ticking the boxes. You don't want to do that. You, of course, want to have all the points that you definitely want to cover, so at some point you do them. But you also, like, I aim for my conversations to be conversations, not Q&As. And therefore it's important to put the person at ease, which I often do by asking a few personal questions at the start. What do they read? Who are their big influences? What are the books they love? And as you get into that, they hopefully relax with you, and you can, once they relax and they figure out that this is not going to be a Q&A, you just have a much better conversation. So yeah, and what that also means is that because you're willing to follow strands where they may go, your knowledge has to be far deeper. It can't, you can have a list of 20 questions, but you can't restrict yourself to the 20 questions. You also have the knowledge to be able to go into a 21st direction that the other person goes into. And obviously the directions I go in, because like I said earlier, my priority is really to be authentic to myself and my own intellectual quest. So therefore the directions I go in will often reflect my interests and my biases, which I think is perfectly fine.
Thank you. In some sense, just connecting the dots back to where we started with reading, I think one thing we see in your conversations is that you're able to take it in that 21st direction, because there is a foundation of reading that has preceded it, plus several years of mulling over some of these things. Perhaps that is where the foundation for a great conversation often lies. Since we briefly spoke about different, we're probably in the middle trying to make the twain meet. So how do you deal with confirmation bias in terms of the curation, the guests? Is that a conscious kind of thought that you have when you're trying to program your podcast these days?
In the sense that one thing that I think people don't understand is that I disagree with every single guest I've had on the show on something or the other. People assume that I'm in some kind of an echo chamber. But what I also do is that when I disagree on the show, my point is not to do a hard talk gotcha show where I'll catch the person and say, "Oh, look, you're such a hypocrite, and you said this in the past," and that's not my point at all. My point is to really have a conversation where I can get the deepest possible understanding of what my guest thinks about a particular subject. And often they'll be experts on it. Mostly they'll be experts on it. And therefore, I phrase my disagreements often as questions. And even when I phrase them as disagreements, I won't belabor the point. I'll let the listener make up their own mind. An example of this is an episode I did with Jerry Rao Jethina, the Indian conservative. He's written a book on Indian conservatism, where I disagreed with him throughout, but I did it in such a way that most people didn't realize. And he himself was extremely happy with the show because he felt that it gave him a platform where he could express himself without being harangued or attacked. So you aim for something like that. And I try to get, because by necessity, most people disagree with me because I don't belong anywhere on the spectrum of left and right and whatever. And therefore, that's a given. That doesn't bother me. I'm very happy having people I disagree with and exploring those disagreements. And sometimes, as far as facts or narratives are concerned, they might change or deepen my understanding of the world. And going back to your earlier point about how your other reading informs the questions you ask in a particular episode, that's absolutely true. A recent example of that is I recorded an episode with Kapil Komireddy on his book Malevolent Republic. And there for about half an hour at the start, we spoke about Jinnah and Savarkar and a period in Indian history, which he has not written about at length in his book at all. So it's just him and me and two history buffs talking about that period in time. And it is not anywhere in my notes or in the subject or whatever. Is off the cuff, which also comes from, if I choose subjects which are interesting to me, and often if they are interesting to me, I already have some kind of background information on those subjects and which I can bring to the show. And of course, sometimes I choose subjects which I don't know so much about. So there I am constrained by the 21st question direction, as it were. But yeah, if you do your prep well enough, you can have a good time.
All right. So we'll move ahead to a couple of assorted questions before we come to the last piece. So one is, I think Vineet had a question about fiction. So go ahead, Vineet, ask that question.
Hey Amit, so I've read My Friend Sancho a long time ago, and I wanted to know if you're planning to write fiction again.
Yeah, thank you. And cringe, I hate that book, but I am actually trying to finish a novel now. Yeah, I'm trying to do that. It's one of the great regrets of my life that one of the things I'm passionate about, which is writing fiction, is something I've done so little of, and the one published book I've written is garbage. And so hopefully, I hope to redeem myself in the near future.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
I think I joined Vineet in saying it was not that bad. It was pretty good. I think unless the second book comes out and gives us a chance to compare the two, I think that's what we're going to say. Trilok had a question. I think he still doesn't have a way to ask that, so I'll ask on his behalf. What are you reading these days, or what is on your bookshelf right now?
It's very arbitrary stuff. Yesterday I read Ghachar Ghochar by Vivek Shanbag and I liked it so much that I'm going to read everything else by him, obviously, which is how you get into books. But otherwise, what I'm actually going to do for the next month or so is try to finish a book that I've been writing and therefore not read all that much and just try to work on that. A lot of my reading is driven by the episodes I'm doing, but again, I'm back till June. And I've been reading up stuff on the pandemic and what's happening around us and all of that. And right now, I think in terms of information, we are in the fog of war. So I am very hesitant of drawing any hard opinions about what is going on and whether the government is doing the right thing or the wrong thing or whatever. I think no one can know that right now. Later on, it will be very easy to pontificate with the benefit of hindsight. But I'm trying to read up a bit on, say, the 1918 flu, Spanish flu, for example, and how pandemics generally spread and the immune system. Reading a book called Immune, I forget the name of the author, it's pretty good. So stuff like that. So my reading is not organized at all. It's very arbitrary. I'll pick up stuff or some friend will recommend something and I'll read that and so on. Yeah.
Thanks, Amit. That sounds just like us, so we'll feel a little happy about that. We don't need a system. Rather, you don't need a particularly goal-driven approach to this. You can just go in directions that you choose to. Okay, folks, if you have any questions for Amit, put them in the chat and we'll invite you. But assuming that we've covered most of your questions, we'll go to our last section. It's called the unseen, and it goes back to a particularly sordid part of Amit's life that I think is buried even deeper than My Friend Sancho, is the time he used to be a quizzer. Okay, and since there are a few of us here who quiz, we couldn't let him go without putting him under the scanner. But Bhavna has a question before that, so go ahead, Bhavna. We can take your question.
Thanks, Ramanand. Hi, Amit. And like Sneha and others have mentioned already, I'm a big fan of the podcast. And I do want to acknowledge that you don't shy away from asking tough questions, even though we know that sometimes your guests may go in different directions, but you rein them in and do get to the questions. So that's very good. Thank you. I have a very silly question actually. And this is a conversation I sometimes have with my husband. So he's like you, he listens to things at 2x or more speeds. And then when we are having a conversation, I see him tuning out a little bit. Or even if it's both of us trying to watch a movie at 1x and he just like zones out. Do you have that problem in real life as well? Or are you able to navigate between the two pretty seamlessly?
Thank you for the kind words. And hi to your husband. No, I have that problem massively. I zone out all the time. I cannot focus on, I cannot, like my wife would have that same complaint, maybe at 2x. Yeah, I don't know why that is or whether there's any connection there or whatever. Maybe it's a specific type of person. But I have a very hard time focusing on anything in the real world. And if I may speculate and think aloud, one reason for that could be that we all know that when we are paying attention on something and we're distracted, it takes a certain amount of your energy each time to be distracted and to come back, distracted and come back. So if you're someone who's living in your head a lot of the time, as I do, and I wouldn't dare to give this excuse to my wife, but if you're someone who lives a lot in your head, as I do, then everything that happens outside is like a distraction. And you tend to tune in for a moment if it's essential and then tune back out and go back to your head. and therefore you miss a lot of things that are happening, which can regrettably happen in conversations and should utterly be avoided in spousal conversations. But otherwise, I think, yeah, it's one of those things that is there. It happens, it's reality.
All right. Thank you.
I know one other thing that's common to her husband, and you're both Pune quizzers, and I think we'll blame it on that. Okay. Manas has a slightly, before we end with the quiz, Manas has a question. I'm going to read it out from the chat. This is a big question, so it's probably the iceberg part or the underneath, submerged part of the iceberg. What gives you hope and what drives you to despair? Right?
Okay, so I know that's someone who listens to the podcast. That is one of the tropes I keep asking my guest at. What gives me despair is that we are incredibly polarized and no one really cares about the truth. We just want to arrive at whatever position we arrive at and then find other people like us, form echo chambers, signal allegiance to our tribe. And it seems to me that the world is getting more and more divided, and also that states are getting more and more powerful vis-a-vis the individual, and every day we turn more into subjects and citizens, and that can deepen during emergencies like this one, where the state takes on a lot more power. So that gives me despair. But what gives me hope is that I think where political movements and intellectual movements have largely failed in winning the battle for liberalism, or what I call liberalism, like kind of classical liberalism, technology may succeed, in the sense that I think technology has empowered individuals at an insane level. We've normalized everything, but you look at all the ways in just the last 10 years that we have been empowered as individuals by technology, and it's mind blowing. And my hope is that continues.
Thanks, Manas. Thanks, Amit. So, Amit, are you ready for the 3-part unseen quiz?
I wasn't a very good quizzer back in the day, as you would know, certainly nowhere near an ace like you. But yes, with much trepidation, I shall submit myself to this.
Okay, and for the rest of you, you get to go after Amit chooses to pass to you. So, Amit, here's the first question. So, everything is connected to you. Okay, that's your big hint. So, whose hands are these, Amit?
Jesus
Not yours.
Christ.
But look at the picture closely. You know how we quiz. And folks, if you know, go ahead, Amit.
Is that an O-ring? Is that the space shuttle O-ring that caused the damage? I don't know. How could that be
So, whose
related
hand
to
would it therefore be? It is an O-ring.
Okay, I succeed in the first part. This is where I need a team. This is where I can, my
All right,
teammate
Raman
can.
wants to team up with Amit Varma. Here's your chance. So tell him or help him. This is an O-ring, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess this would be Richard Feynman.
Amit, you want to accept that answer from your new teammate?
I don't have a better alternative, so I'll accept that answer from my new teammate.
Let's see the answer. It is Richard Feynman. Well done, both of you.
Okay. But how does it relate to me? That's what I was trying to figure out. I know Feynman showed the whole O-ring thing at the time, but
it's a slightly convoluted connect, but I think you wrote a piece, I think last year when Abhijit Banerjee won the Nobel, and you quoted Kramer's O-ring paper in it. So that's why we brought it out of the woodwork in a sense.
My God. Yeah.
Okay.
Nice one.
All right. Second one, because you used to be a chess player and a pretty good one at that, explain Hikaru Nakamura's cool look in this match against Magnus Carlsen.
I know Hikaru used to take poker very seriously, and I was, of course, a professional poker player for a while. So I presume he's wearing those sunglasses so Carlsen cannot make out from his responses whether he thinks a move is good or bad. So in a sense, he can bluff. And bluffing, by the way, is very common in chess. People don't realize that. They think it's a game of perfect information. But bluffing is very common. For example, what happens at the highest level is that when two players are playing a prepared line, one of them may go beyond his preparation, but blitzer moves out fast. So his opponent thinks that it is part of prep, and that is intimidating, which is one of the examples of bluffing that you can do in chess. Is that correct?
Okay, Amit, thanks for a great explanation, but we will have to go to the audience for the answer to that. You've got it. You're close, but you're not. You don't. It's a more bizarre explanation than that. Does anyone else want to give this a shot? I'll just check the chat to see if anyone wants to go. Okay. Does anyone want to help Amit with this answer? Harish, maybe? Someone else?
Does he have conjunctivitis?
No, he doesn't. It's a bizarre reason. It's common in the chess world where people are a little bizarre in general, but this befits the highest level of chess.
So, Amit, you were quite close. You said Carlson should not be able to make out what he's thinking. But no, flip it if you can. Flip that line of thinking.
I can't flip it. What, Nakamura doesn't want to look at Carlson? I don't know.
So Nakamura doesn't want to show his eyes to Carlson. Why would that be? Because he believes Carlson can do what?
Carlson can make out whether how he's feeling from the dilation of the pupils. That's a standard poker.
It's the other way around. So that's what Harish means by flip it.
Manas
it's not,
on the chat.
It's not passive, it's active. Manas, go ahead. It's not Eye of the Sovereign Trilog, but Manas, go ahead.
It's pretty obvious now that you've made it simple. It should be hypnosis, hypnotizing.
Right. There was a rumor going around that Carlson was using hypnosis on his opponents and psych them into making certain moves. So Nakamura apparently wrote this so that he didn't want to take a chance.
That's very dubious. This might be urban legend. I've followed both their careers very closely for more than 13 years now since they were kids. And by the way, extra points for the person whose blurred figure you can see behind Nakamura. Can anyone make out who that is? A big fan of classical music. Okay, no one. That's Levon Aronian. Let's continue.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And our last question for today. Roger Federer has received at least 3 of these. There's no record of Amit doing so. In Federer's case, he didn't keep them in the usual trophy cabinet. We are sure that Amit probably would. So what gift are we talking about?
Good God, he won a quiz. He won 3 quizzes. I don't have much of that in my trophy cabinet.
Closer to your heart.
Closer to my heart.
Anyone wants to help him out?
Did he get books you won't keep? But Amit definitely
okay, let's admit right wingers would probably get this, would celebrate this along with you.
Oh, okay.
Neha, go ahead. Help Amit out.
Is this a cow? And I don't label myself as a right winger.
And,
that's such a great guess. That's a great guess. I love it. Yeah, he's received 3 cows. He's Swiss also, no?
And final C, the answer is, you're right. Well done. So
Wow.
we all know a little bit about its bovine fixation, if you can put it that way, or udder fixation as Blackadder might call it. So yes, that's the right answer. Well done, Sneha. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Amit. This was great. We loved having you and take your time out to speak to us in great length. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure being here. And Ramanand, Harish, I hope another 10 years don't pass before we speak next.
Sure, we'll try and make sure of that. All right, folks, thank you so much. And we'll catch up soon. And thank you, Amit. Everyone stay safe. We'll see you soon.